CHAPTER 26 of God's Country and the Woman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. God's Country and the Woman by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 26. In a moment the flying figure of the Free Trader had disappeared. With a last glance at Jean, who was slowly sinking back into the snow, Philip dashed in pursuit. Where Lang had buried himself in the deeper forest the trees grew so thick that Philip could not see 50 yards ahead of him. But Lang's trail was distinct and alone. He was running swiftly. Philip had noticed that Lang had no rifle. He dropped his own now and drew his pistol. Thus unencumbered he made swifter progress. He had expected to overtake Lang within 400 or 500 yards. But minute followed minute in the mad race without another view of his enemy. He heard a few faint shouts back in the direction of the Devil's Nest, the barking of dogs, and half a dozen shots, the sounds growing fainter and fainter. And then Lang's trail led him unexpectedly into one of the foot-beaten aisles of the forest, where there were the tracks of a number of men. At this point the thick spruce formed a roof overhead that shut out the fresh snow, and Philip lost several minutes before he found a place where Lang had left the trail to bury himself again in the unblazed forest. Half a mile further he followed the Free Trader's trail without catching a glimpse of the man. He was at least a mile from the Devil's Nest when he heard sounds ahead of him. Beyond a clump of balsam he heard the voices of men, and then the whine of a cuffed dog. Cautiously he picked his way through the thick cover until he crouched close to the edge of a small open. In an instant it seemed as though his heart had leapt from his breast into his throat and was choking him. Within 50 paces of him were both Lang and Thoreau. But for a moment he scarcely saw them, or the powerful team of 8 huskies, harnessed and waiting. For on the sledge, a cloth bound about her mouth, her hands tied behind her, was Josephine. At the sight of her, Philip did not pause to plan an attack. The one thought that leapt into his brain like fire was that Lang and Thoreau had fooled the forest people. Josephine had not been taken to the Devil's Nest, and the two were attempting to get away with her. A cry burst from his lips as he ran from cover. Instantly the pair were facing him. Lang was still panting from his run. He held no weapons. In the crook of Thoreau's arm rested a rifle. Swift as a flash he raised it to his shoulder, the muzzle levelled at Philip's breast. Josephine had turned. From her smothered lips came a choking cry of agony. Philip had now raised his automatic. It was level with his waistline. From that position he had trained himself to fire with the deadly precision that is part of the training of the men of the Royal Northwest Mounted. Before Thoreau's forefinger had pressed the trigger of his rifle a stream of fire shot out from the muzzle of the automatic. Thoreau did not move. Then a shudder passed through him. His rifle dropped from his nerveless hands. Without a moan he crumpled down into the snow. 3 of the 5 bullets that had flashed like lightning from the black-muzzled savage had passed completely through his body. It had all happened in a space so short that Lang had not stirred. Now he found himself looking into that little engine of death. With a cry of fear he staggered back. Philip did not fire. He felt in himself now the tigerish madness that had been in John Adare. To him Thoreau had been no more than a wolf, one of the many at Devil's Nest. Lang was different. For all things this monster was accountable. He had no desire to shoot. He wanted to reach him with his hands, to choke the life from him slowly, to hear from his own blackening lips the confession that had come through Jean Croisset. He knew that Josephine was on her feet now, that she was struggling to free her hands. But it was only in a swift glance that he saw this. In the same breath he had dropped his pistol, and was at Lang's throat. They went down together. Even Thoreau, a giant in size and strength, would not have been a match for him now. Every animal passion in him was roused to its worst. Lang's jaws shot apart, his eyes protruded, his tongue came out. The breath rattled in his throat. Then, for a moment, Philip's death grip relaxed. He bent down until his lips were close to the death-filled face of his victim. "The truth, Lang, or I'll kill you," he whispered hoarsely. And then he asked the question, and as he asked Josephine freed her hands. She tore the cloth from her mouth, but before she could rush forward, through Lang's mottling lips had come the choking words: "It was Miriam's." Again Philip's fingers sank in their death grip in Lang's throat. 20 seconds more and he would have fulfilled his pact with Jean. A scream from Josephine turned his eyes for an instant from his victim. Out of that same cover of balsam 3 men were rushing upon him. A glance told him they were not of the forest people. He had time to gain his feet before they were upon him. It was a fight for life now, and his one hope lay in the fact that his assailants, escaping from the nest, did not want to betray themselves by using firearms. The first man at him he struck a terrific blow that sent him reeling. A second caught his arm before he could recover himself, and then it was the hopeless struggle of 1 against 3. Josephine stood free. She had seen Philip drop his pistol, and she sprang to the spot where it had fallen. It was buried under the snow. The 4 men were on the ground now, Philip under. She heard a gasping sound, and then, far away, something else. A sound that thrilled her, that sent her voice back through the forest in cry after cry. What she heard was the wailing cry of the dog pack, her pack, following over the trail which her abductors had made in their flight from Adare House. A few steps away she saw a heavy stick in the snow. Fiercely she tore it loose, ran back to the men, and began striking blindly at those who were choking the life from Philip. Lang had risen to his knees, clutching his throat, and now staggered toward her. She struck at him, and he caught the club. The dogs heard her cries now. Half a mile back in the forest they were coming in a gray, fierce horde. Only Josephine knew as she struggled with Lang. Under his assailants Philip's strength was leaving him. Iron fingers gripped at his throat. A flood of fire seemed bursting in his head. Josephine's cries were drifting further and further away, and his face was as Lang's face had been a few moments before. Nearer and nearer swept the pack, covering that last half mile with the speed of the wind, the huge yellow form of Hero leading the others by a body's length. They made no sound now. When they shot out of the forest into the little opening they had come so silently that even Lang did not see them. In another moment they were upon him. Josephine staggered back, her eyes big and wild with horror. She saw him go down, and then his shrieks rang out like a madman's. The others were on their feet, and not until she saw Philip lying still and white on the snow did the power of speech return to her lips. She sprang toward the dogs. "Kill! Kill! Kill!" she cried. "Hero! Kill! Nippa Hao! Boys! Beaver! Wolf! Hero! Captain! Kill! Kill! Kill!" As her own voice rang out, Lang's screams ceased, and then she saw Philip dragging himself to his knees. At her calls there came a sudden surge in the pack, and those who could not get at Lang leaped upon the remaining 3. With a cry Josephine fell upon her knees beside Philip, clasping his head in her arms, holding him in the protection of her own breast as they looked upon the terrible scene. For a moment more she looked, and then she dropped her face on Philip's shoulder with a ghastly cry. Still partly dazed, Philip stared. Screams such as he had never heard before came from the lips of the dying men. From screams they turned to moaning cries, then to a horrible silence broken only by the snarling grind